We were all excited for the field trip, a day away from the usual classroom routine, and who wouldn't be thrilled? Our teacher, Mr. Sutton, was in charge. He was the kind of teacher everyone liked, easygoing but strict when needed. The plan was simple: hike up the Enchanted Rock, explore the area, and be back before dusk. We were a group of 15 students, all juniors from Austin High, and we thought we knew what to expect, but nothing could have prepared us for what happened. The hike started like any other. Mr. Sutton led the way, reminding us to stick together and stay on the trail. The sun was bright and the weather was perfect. It was one of those days that made you feel good to be outside. We chatted, laughed, and took pictures as we walked. The Enchanted Rock was massive, and the view from the top was supposed to be amazing. But we never got there. After about an hour of walking, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a break. Mr. Sutton gathered us around and gave a brief history of the place. He told us about the Native American legends that surrounded the area, how the rock was considered sacred, and how some believed it was haunted. We all laughed it off, thinking it was just a story to make the trip more interesting. As we continued, I noticed Mr. Sutton was starting to lag behind. At first I thought he was just giving us some space, letting us lead for a change, but then he disappeared. One minute he was there, and the next he was gone. We called out for him, thinking he might have wandered off to take a picture or something, but there was no answer. Panic set in quickly. We retraced our steps, calling out his name over and over. Some of us started to run back down the trail, thinking he might have gone back to the clearing, but he wasn't there either. Hours passed, and the sun was starting to set. We were getting more and more desperate. We tried to stay together, but fear was creeping in. What if something had happened to him? What if he was hurt or worse? Just when we were about to give up and head back to the bus, one of the students, Maria, screamed. We all ran to where she was standing, and that's when we saw it. His body. It was hidden beneath a pile of rocks, almost as if someone had tried to bury him. His face was bruised and his clothes were torn. It was clear he had been attacked. I felt sick. My hands started shaking and I couldn't breathe. It was like something out of a nightmare, but it was real. We were just kids. This wasn't supposed to happen to us. We called the police and they arrived within an hour. They took statements from all of us, asking if we had seen anything suspicious, if anyone had left the group. But we were all together the whole time. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. The police started to question us more intensely, trying to figure out who could have done this. The realization hit us all at once. Someone among us had to be the killer. There was no other explanation. It was the most terrifying thought I've ever had. We had all known each other for years, but now we were looking at each other with suspicion. Who could do something like this? The rest of the night was a blur. We were taken back to the bus, but no one spoke. The drive back to Austin was the longest and most silent journey I've ever experienced. No one slept. We just stared at each other, each of us wondering the same thing. Who was it? The news hit the school the next day, and the investigation went on for weeks. They questioned us over and over, but there were no leads, no evidence that pointed to anyone. It was like the perfect crime. Eventually the case went cold, and we were left with more questions than answers. I still think about that day, about how quickly everything can change. One minute we were just kids on a field trip, and the next we were suspects in a murder. The worst part is not knowing who did it. Every time I see one of my classmates, I can't help but wonder if they're the one who killed Mr. Sutton. It's a question that haunts me, one that I know I'll never get an answer to. We were supposed to be on a simple day hike. Nothing special, just a few hours in Sam Houston National Forest with our science class. Our teacher, Mr. Graves, was always pushing us to explore, to learn outside the classroom. But this time we learned more than we ever wanted to. The hike started off normal enough. We were a group of about 10 students from a middle school in Houston. The sun was shining and the forest was beautiful. Birds singing in the distance. We were laughing, joking around, not paying much attention to where we were going. Mr. Graves kept reminding us to stay on the trail, but we were too excited to listen. About an hour into the hike, we came across something strange. There was a narrow path leading off the main trail, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It wasn't on the map Mr. Graves had shown us earlier. Naturally, we were curious. Let's check it out, someone suggested. At first, Mr. Graves was against it. He wanted to stick to the plan, but after a little persuasion, he finally agreed to let us explore, though he made us promise not to wander off too far. The path was barely visible, and it was clear that it hadn't been used in years. As we walked, the forest became denser, the trees seemed taller, and the air felt colder. It didn't take long before we saw it, a cabin, old and worn down, standing alone in the middle of the woods. The cabin looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was rotting, the windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges. Despite Mr. Graves' warnings, we were too curious to turn back. We decided to take a closer look. Stepping inside, we were hit with a smell that was hard to describe. Something between damp wood and something worse, something metallic. The inside was dark, with only slivers of light coming through the cracked windows. We could barely see, but what we could make out was disturbing. The walls were covered in scratches, deep and jagged, like someone or something had tried to claw its way out. There were old bloodstains on the floor, long dried but unmistakable. And then we found the Polaroids. They were scattered across a dusty table, old and faded. Each one showed a different person, but all had the same look of terror on their faces. Some were crying, others looked like they were screaming, but all of them were clearly afraid. We couldn't stop looking at them, our minds racing with questions we didn't want answers to. Then we heard it. Footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from outside. Mr. Graves motioned for us to be quiet, and we all froze. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the cabin. We didn't dare breathe. We could see a shadow moving just outside the broken window, a figure standing still for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought whoever was outside would hear it. And then the door creaked open. A man stepped inside, his face hidden under a dirty hood, but we could see the glint of a large knife in his hand. He moved slowly, almost like he was searching for something or someone. Mr. Graves motioned for us to stay low, to stay hidden, and we did our best to blend into the shadows. The man walked further into the cabin, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He didn't seem to notice us at first, but then he stopped. He turned his head slowly, and for a moment I was sure he saw us. But then he continued on, moving toward the back of the cabin. It was then that Mr. Graves whispered for us to run. We didn't need to be told twice. As quietly as we could, we slipped out of the cabin and sprinted back down the narrow path, our hearts racing with fear. I didn't look back. None of us did. When we finally reached the main trail, we kept running until we found a park ranger. We told him everything about the cabin, the Polaroids, the man with the knife. The police were called, and we were taken back to the school, shaken and scared. They searched the forest, but they never found the man or the cabin. It was like it had never existed. The whole thing was written off as a prank or an overactive imagination. But we knew what we saw. Even now, I still think about that day, about what would have happened if we hadn't escaped. That cabin, those photos, that man, it's a memory that haunts me, a nightmare that I can't forget. And I know I'm not the only one. My name is Jared, and I'll never forget the field trip that changed everything. We were just a group of students from San Antonio, excited to spend a day outside of the classroom, exploring the old battlefield we had heard so much about in history class. It was supposed to be a simple visit, learn about the past, maybe take a few pictures, and be back home by the afternoon. But what happened that day left us all shaken, and I still have nightmares about it. The battlefield was huge, sprawling across acres of land. Our teacher, Meister Anders, led us through the tour, pointing out landmarks and telling us stories about the battles that took place there. The place had a strange feeling to it though, like the air was thicker, heavier. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but I could tell the others felt it too. As we walked through the site, weird things started happening. We heard whispers, faint and distant, like someone was talking just out of earshot. But whenever we looked around, there was no one there. Then there were the cold gusts of wind that would come out of nowhere, chilling us to the bone even though it was a warm day. And the feeling of being watched. It was like someone's eyes were on us the whole time, but we couldn't see who. Most of the students stayed close to Mr. Anders, but I was curious. I've always been the kind of person who likes to explore, to find things others miss. So when I noticed an old building off to the side, a little away from the main group, I decided to check it out. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, I just slipped away and headed towards it. The building was small, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The door was slightly ajar, and without thinking, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, musty and damp, like the place had been sealed off for a long time. It was dark, but enough light filtered through the broken windows for me to see. The room was empty except for a few old crates and what looked like a makeshift bed in the corner. I almost turned around and left, but then I saw it. A small door at the back of the room, almost hidden behind a stack of crates. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved the crates aside and opened the door. Inside was a small, cramped room, barely big enough for one person to stand in. But what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There were photos pinned to the walls, photos of children all looking scared, some crying. They looked like they had been taken in secret without the kids knowing. Beneath the photos was a table, and on it was an old journal. My hands were shaking as I opened it and started reading. It detailed the last moments of these kids, describing how they were taken and what was done to them. It was horrifying, like something out of a nightmare. I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could, but just as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked up, there was a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a dirty hat pulled low over his face. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me with this cold, empty look. "You're not supposed to be here," he finally said, his voice low and menacing. He stepped closer, and I could see the glint of something metal in his hand, a knife. I didn't wait to find out what he was going to do. I bolted past him, not looking back, just running as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the main group. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because Mr. Anders immediately asked me what was wrong. I tried to explain, to tell them what I'd found, but when we went back to the building, it was empty. The photos were gone, the journal was gone, and so was the man. It was like none of it had ever been there. The police were called and they searched the area, but they didn't find anything. No one believed me. Everyone thought I had imagined it, that maybe I'd let the spooky atmosphere of the place get to me. But I know what I saw, and I know that someone dangerous was out there. We left the battlefield that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched the entire time. The memory of that room, those photos, and that man haunts me, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did.